Okay, good morning. I call the meeting to order. Today is the second day of the public hearings, and we do have a very full schedule of witnesses, including witnesses from overseas. They will be giving evidence this afternoon by video conferencing. May I now invite the witness to come forward to the witness table? Hi, good morning. For the record, could you please state the name and your position in your organization?
Shashi Jayakumar, Head of the Center of Excellence for National Security, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University.
Thank you. The evidence you'll be giving today before the committee will be taken on oath. If you so desire, you can take an affirmation. Clerk of Parliament, please.
Yes, Your Honor. I, Shashi Jayakumar, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence which I shall give before this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please be seated. Welcome to the public hearing on the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods. The focus for today's evidence gathering session is for us to put questions to you. You have taken a solemn obligation to answer our questions truthfully. I now call on Minister Shan to raise his questions.
Morning, Shashi.
Minister, morning.
Can you pick up your written representations,
Yes,
if
sir.
you have it with you?
Yes.
And we will also flash the relevant paragraphs on the screen. What I'm intent to do is to run through with you your statement, and at appropriate points may ask you to elaborate a little bit, but basically to have it on record, as it were. It's already on record, but just to bring out some points. So in the second paragraph, I think you make the point that messaging through modern technology can target individuals in a persuasive, highly individualized forms. And since there is no need to appeal across the board, targeting at the individual level has corroded the democratic process. Could you explain what you mean, please?
Minister, in the current context of information warfare, as asymmetric warfare doctrine would have it, internal opposition, seeding internal opposition within the target country is extremely important. This is not necessarily entirely new. However, the technological tsunami and the growth of data-rich societies has given the aggressor enormous opportunity to try to subvert individual slices of one particular country, one particular target country, in a way which would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. So some of the obvious examples out there, Facebook, also messaging services, where, for example, in a country, we'll take the Singapore example, you could narrowcast your message to one particular group, an ethnic group, a communal group, a racial group, and say, for example, you are not really Singaporean, appealing to other more ancestral kinds of proclivities, and saying you should cleave to that. And that's very, very important, because that, in a small, diverse country like Singapore, has the potential to tear a big rent in the social fabric.
Right. Thank you. The next paragraph, modern information technologies empower and incentivize subversion at scale. In cyberspace, there is no requirement, of course, for messages to have a direct connection to the truth, and either way, the perpetrator of falsehoods can mask its tracks and have some degree of plausible deniability. Why not then employ these techniques to undermine resilience in targeted countries? And when these methods can be far cheaper and less bloody than warfare, and which may be more precisely tailored to achieve state aims compared to diplomacy. It was, after all, Sun Tzu who observed that to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Would you explain that, please?
Yes, Minister. If you look at some of the current conflicts which are ongoing worldwide now, for example, the Russian annexation of Crimea, or their active measures in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, for example, you see the full panoply of this spectrum of active measures on full view. appealing, for example, to the Russian minority in that part of Ukraine, and also spreading lies, rumors, disinformation to say that they are the subject of persecution. So that's spreading disinformation and rumors in the target country. But equally important, and this might not be completely clear in the paragraph, is that you manufacture a truth for your own domestic constituency as well, for the Russian people within Russia, Putin's Russia. There's no doubt at all in their mind that Putin is fighting a just war and that they are protecting other people, Russian minorities elsewhere. The actual degree of verisimilitude, the quality of truth, does not actually matter. What matters more in this case is that the Russian state has achieved its state objectives and got the right people to believe what it wants.
Yes. I think just a point of clarification. I mean, you will have your views, but obviously you can understand the select committee will not take any specific view as to whether President Putin has done something or Russia has done something,
Yes,
or for
Mr.
that matter, China or United States.
Yes, Mr.
But, you know, we hear your views. Next paragraph, the next page. You talk about General Gerasimov, his doctrine. He was the chief of general staff, or is the chief of general staff of the Russian armed forces. And he said, information space opens wide asymmetrical possibilities for reducing the fighting potential of the enemy. A great deal of what Russia has tried in the European Union and its former satellites in Europe has disinformation at its heart, spreading rumors to discredit politicians and to play up certain themes, such as negative portrayals of immigration policy, have been aimed at undermining public trust towards democracy and systematically influence populations to become less trusting of mainstream established news networks. Instead, they would put more trust on fringe sources of news, often backed by Russia and conspiracy narratives. Would you maybe spend a few minutes, because you are the experts and people here don't necessarily know, what is the Gerasimov doctrine?
Yes, Minister. Maybe I could go into a little bit more detail because I was not able to put the full story inside
Yes, please.
Submission. The story really begins with the Gerasimov doctrine around February 13, when in a niche...
February 2013.
February 2013, correct.
Right.
When a Russian newspaper, there is a Russian name for it, but the English translation is the Military Industrial Courier. It's a niche Russian military publication. Not very exciting publication, usually does not get read, but it reprinted a speech by the Chief General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, where he talked about how in the modern world, the use of propaganda and subversion were not simply civilian tools. They had to be used by militaries as well to achieve their aims in state conflict. And if I may be permitted to quote, he talked about a conflict where, I quote, "A perfectly thriving state can, in a matter of months and even days, be transformed into an arena of fierce armed conflict, become a victim of foreign intervention, and sink into a web of chaos, humanitarian catastrophe, and civil war," unquote. And
where is this quote found?
this is the quote translated from the February
original publication.
2013.
It'll be helpful if you give the original references to us.
These will be provided, Minister.
Thank you. Please carry on. Yeah.
My reading of what General Valery Gerasimov was saying is that the use of special forces, hybrid tools of military warfare, as well as informational actions, had to be used holistically in a full spectrum to achieve state aims. I should point out at this stage that none of this is exactly earth-shattering or new. This has been part of military doctrine for a long time.
You weaken the enemy psychologically, you sow confusion, and you sow discord, and it reduces the will to fight.
Absolutely, Minister. When the analyst parsed his words, the one point which seemed a little bit new and quite interesting was when he talked about the use of not just informational actions, but also seeding internal oppositions within the country itself. And this, maybe not earth-shattering, but seemed to cause a new wrinkle on how aggressors could perpetuate, far in advance of any armed or kinetic conflict, the undermining of the resilience in
the word fifth column has a long history.
Exactly, fifth column, Minister. If I can make a final observation on Gerasimov, the real military experts will point out that there is no Gerasimov doctrine. This is a simplification. What they actually mean is that if you look at the history of mass persuasion, particularly employed by the Soviets back to the Bolshevik Revolution, this has always been on the agenda. There is perhaps a newfangled terminology, a new verbiage, a new vocabulary attached to it. And indeed, some of Gerasimov's predecessors as Chief of General Staff, including Makarov, his immediate predecessor, deserve some of the credit for developing this doctrine further. So the hardcore analysts would say that Gerasimov doctrine is a bit of an oversimplification. But the point is that there's a new wrinkle being cast on old doctrine.
How does it relate to the original Soviet concept of disinformation or information warfare?
Minister, when I travel to some of these countries, including the Ukraine, and I'm given briefings on precisely that topic, it's interesting that every single official briefing starts with a history lecture on the Bolshevik Revolution from 1917. How, in order to achieve the aims of the revolution, the KGB or the successor of the KGB, there's a name for it, the Cheka, and it's the other forebearers of the KGB, had to employ these tools and techniques of mass persuasion, samizdat, manuscript material circulated in private to subvert enemies and to convince its own people. So what you could say about the propagation of this kind of material nowadays is that they use new technological tools, perhaps, but the methods, the stratagems, the use of circulating material in a very underground guerrilla fashion to persuade people, mass persuasion, is perhaps not so new. There's a history to it.
What's new is the means of delivery of such.
Very, very potent, much more potent than in former times.
Now, this is one aspect, covert, using technology to subvert a country by seeding opposition, by seeding doubts, by targeting populations, by encouraging ethnic and racial and other sort of divisions and rivalries. There is another aspect of technology, which is a direct cyber attack to take down utilities, power stations, trains, airports, try and bring an entire country to a standstill, which we have read about, and some of it has been tried. How do you put this side by side? Are they two sides of a coin? Are they sort of overall using modern technology?
Minister, in my view, the best aggressive actors, state actors, have a full spectrum. And the full spectrum includes, on one end, kinetic warfare, insurgency, plausible deniability insurgency, little green men in the Ukraine, which will later turned out to be special forces commandos in Mufti, and then cyber attacks. The kinetic attacks, not simply malware, which can bring down, for example, the Ukrainian power grid, which actually did happen. Also instrumentalizing minorities in target countries, your minorities. Also, for example, the use of proxy NGOs and infiltrating them. And also, as in recently been alleged in Australia, for example, infiltrating community language newspapers of that particular language to appeal to the minority. And also, of course, disinformation on a more general scale, utilizing agents of influence and so on and so forth. The best of the actors in this game, Minister, use the full suite, but not necessarily the entire suite. They know when to chop and change, when to utilize that precise tool in the toolkit, when it suits their interests best. So that is my reading.
Right. Yeah. The next paragraph, you say the full story of what exactly Russia attempted in terms of opinion manipulation in the 2016 US presidential elections will probably not be apparent for some time to come. But you say, however, the scale and ingenuity was striking. Some researchers think they have found fake Facebook groups almost entirely populated by bots. These fake groups convincingly operated and orchestrated, but operated by bots and artificial intelligence, leveraged on existing ideological filter bubbles and echo chambers, eventually attracting real fans. Would you describe this in a little bit more? I mean, I want to understand, I think we need to understand, perhaps step by step, the modus operandi.
This is one of the most interesting and in some ways most compelling cases which has been uncovered by researchers and I think looked at by the security services as well. And a very good example was this fake Twitter account, and the name of the Twitter account was Jenna Abrams. I'll repeat that, Jenna Abrams, who seemed to be a normal, next-door, all-American, everyday kind of girl you meet on the street, very nice, likable, had a huge amount of Twitter followers, but clearly right-wing, far-right. And she induced many people to listen to her, to join her as Twitter followers. In other words, she created her own fan club. And she moved sentiment, she moved opinion as well. But much later on, after the election, researchers discovered the fact that this person did not exist at all. She had been a creation, allegedly, of the Russian state, possibly tied to the Internet Research Agency, which is Kremlin-linked, which has been fingered at the heart of some of the alleged election meddling in the US. To me, as a non-technical cyber expert, this is actually quite interesting because part of the process is clearly automated, and according to some experts, uses AI as well. But the best of these efforts, to my knowledge, actually there's still a human agency at the back end, because to understand the human condition, human motivation, what gets people to move, to think, AI hasn't got that good yet that the full process can be automated. So Jenna Abrams is just one. The suspicion of the people who really know is that there are many. There are many, many. What I find extremely interesting is that the real experts suggest that it's not simply Russian Kremlin-linked Internet Research Agency agencies like that which are pushing the far right in a way that's almost too obvious. There's some suggestion that they are pushing the far left as well, which on the face of it might seem ridiculous because there's no ideological common ground. However, the point, and I think this is actually the real point, is that when you see this dissension or when you undermine the national polity, it actually doesn't really matter who you push, so long as you push opposing forces, different ideological forces that cannot find common ground. And in one egregious example, I cannot remember the exact date, but it's roughly the time of the US election campaign. A fake account like Jenna Abrams actually got both sides, left and right, riled up enough to turn up for a fake protest.
This was in Texas.
I believe so, Minister.
Yeah.
So these fake accounts, powered partly by humans, partly by bots, can have very, very real-world consequences.
Yes. So the modus operandi, we can understand one modus operandi. Set up an account, make it attractive, build up a following, look as if it has got a following through using bots, so multiple likes and support and comments. And over a time, you build up a credible online presence. That then creates its own sort of movement and momentum. And real people then start joining.
Real people are sucked
Real
in.
people start joining.
And if it's very, very successful, the thing acquires a life of its own. So the fake aspects, after a while,
Yes.
can just wither away.
And then you seed sufficient remarks and comments and viewpoints to continue keep it bubbling and hot, and try and divide this group from other groups and create friction.
Exactly, Minister.
That is the real purpose of all of this.
That's a real purpose.
Yeah.
The Russians would also, I have to add this, would have learned from the 2016 experience. The latest indications is that they are becoming even more sophisticated.
Even better.
It's not simply one Facebook account, seeded by other fake Facebook accounts, which are extremely credible and believable.
Right.
AI or a security service has great difficulty in spotting the fake from the non-fake.
You say Russians, but presumably this expertise is available even to much smaller countries. Perhaps not at the same level as the Russians, but it's not very difficult to get this expertise.
It's not very difficult to hire it. So, Minister, there has been a proliferation of agencies which are sort of hired guns, which will parlay this kind of experience for the highest bidder. Cambridge Analytica is one of them. I understand it now has a presence in Malaysia, but there are others. I
Right.
should point out, however, that the expert opinion on how effective these actually are is split. There are some who say to get the real subversion done, you do need some human agencies on the ground, focus groups, or human interventions on the ground to push these people.
But they're not difficult to do if you apply your
difficult.
mind.
Not difficult.
Okay, we'll come to that in a minute. I think the point has been foreshadowed, but if you look at the page 3, second paragraph, you referred to individual consultants and private sector entities specializing in hacking or interfering with elections with the aim of achieving the desired election result for the client. Their methods include smears, hacking, spoofing, web pages, sending mass emails to influence outcomes. And you footnoted to a very Latin-sounding name, and you say that he rigged elections, or rather you quote a Bloomberg article where he rigged elections. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about this?
I apologize. Just give me a second to call up the.
Sorry, it's page 3.
Yes.
The second paragraph, and
Under Sepulveda.
and then Sepulveda, footnote 5.
Minister, he's a notorious hired gun for hire. He will go around primarily in Latin American countries. He is not simply a technical hacker. My understanding is he has some of these skills, but he's also very, very connected in Latin American countries, including some of the leaders. He'll go around offering to rig elections for the highest bidders. Some of his methods would encompass those which are set out in the paragraph within. Not all are technical disinformation or subversion. He would also have some of the real-world interventions I'm talking about. For example, he would organize focus groups to understand the population or the electorate sentiment on the ground itself. He would organize smear campaigns, for example. He would do a lot of things, and he would offer them to the highest bidder, for example, to the politician who wanted to get elected. He was perhaps a little too clever for his own good. He advertised his methods in perhaps an overly public fashion, in my view. So he got caught, and I believe he's either awaiting trial or jail right now. He's just one. He's the one well-known South American case. The smart ones, in my view, will not be as flamboyant or high-profile as him. They would probably be much more discreet in their methods, but they will be known to the people who matter.
All right. And in the next paragraph, you refer to, or you say, more broadly, there also appears to exist a, let's get it up on the screen first. More broadly, there also appears to exist a growing shadow market for methods to influence target populations, outcomes in nations, using methods like those offered by Cambridge Analytica, the company which is said by some reports to have profiled and micro-targeted the US electorate during the 2016 presidential elections. You referred to Cambridge Analytica earlier. Did you say they were in Malaysia now?
They have a presence in Malaysia.
They
That's
have a
correct,
presence
Minister.
in Malaysia.
Yes.
Right.
And the talk is that they're being hired by people who are involved in the coming election.
All right. And everything you have set out here so far, what we've been discussing, is a fundamental root and branch subversion of democracy and free speech, isn't it?
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. What they are doing is using open systems and countries and using the very openness to undermine democracy and free speech.
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. Now, you then say in the next paragraph, military doctrine of major powers evolved to encompass the notion that information and propaganda are just as important as kinetic modes of subjugating the enemy, and you refer to a 1999 book, Unrestricted Warfare, by two relatively senior officers of the PLA. Would you, and they argued that in the face of American technological superiority, the non-kinetic actions might be more important to winning a conflict than weaponry. And the key, can we go over the page, please? The key in future conflicts would be to employ asymmetric attacks on all elements of national power, economic, political, information, and military, as a means to deter, intimidate, or defeat a militarily superior enemy. As the authors observed, nothing is off the table. I think you said a little bit about this earlier. Is there anything that you want to add to this?
The one point I would add, Minister, in my think tank, we have found it quite useful to study, I'll put this as a series of allegations as to what has been done in Australia and to a lesser degree New Zealand over the last couple of years, where there's a great fear over the alleged Chinese influence in that part of Australia. Interesting for my think tank because it is not cyber attack. It is not outright kinetic in any way, but to some degree, allegedly instrumentalizing the minority, Chinese minority, to some degree, trying those methods through the student population in that part of the world, to some degree, infiltrating NGOs, and to some degree, this has garnered the most attention, bribing politicians or paying off politicians. So it's interesting to study the full spectrum and to look at how a state quietly amasses power and influence within another state. And I think this will repay study in the years to come.
Right. Now, this aspect troubles me considerably in our own context, because as you know, we work on the basis that our conventional military capabilities are such that everyone knows that we can defend ourselves. And if I can refer you to some evidence that was given by Dr. Ruska yesterday, I'll have it flashed across on the screen. Dr. Ruska's evidence at page 145, please. If you see my questions, Dr. Ruska, I'm interested in your views on the implications for Singapore, which you refer to in your paper. You talk about asymmetric warfare and information or disinformation campaigns being part of asymmetric warfare. What, in your view, are the implications when, say, a lot of people accept that Singapore's military power is substantial, that it is able to defend itself? Given that, what do you think would be the attractiveness of using asymmetric warfare, disinformation campaign against Singapore by a country that feels that it is not militarily able to challenge Singapore? And his answer, that's an excellent question. In a way, Singapore's deterrence and defense capabilities are second to none in the region. Let's assume he is right, that our deterrence and capabilities are superior to everyone in the region. But again, the changing character of conflict invites asymmetric type of strategies that may offset anyone's military inferiority and achieve similar political outcomes. So think about ways to bypass that power projection capabilities. That's a key point that I mentioned in the paper. In a way, cyber-enabled information conflicts essentially challenge Singapore concepts of deterrence. The different levels of potential attack short of war preclude Singapore's military type of action. So in other words, if Singapore is hit by cyber and information type of attack in conjunction with a terrorist attack, how does Singapore deter them in the first place, and how does Singapore respond to them militarily? Now, leave out for the time being terrorist attacks. Can we have your views as an expert in this area as well? On the assumption that militarily everyone understands that Singapore is able to well defend itself in conventional warfare, to what extent do you think there would be a likelihood, an incentive for countries that want to do us harm, or in the context of a deteriorating relationship? To what extent do you think a Chief of General Staff and his people will have to plan for and prepare for this against us? And if so, taking a leaf out of the Russian book, they should be planning for it much earlier to create the right conditions. To what extent would it be attractive to others? To what extent are we at risk on this, given the nature of our multiracial, multireligious society, and the nature of people who might want to do this to us? near and far?
Thank you, Minister. So I'll begin with the near first. And I don't want to cast allegations against, for example, our near neighbors whom we enjoy
And neither do we. Yes.
excellent relations with, and which show signs of continuing. However, we should look at it from this point of view. Information warfare is now slowly becoming, or it's evolved to become an accepted part of military doctrine. If you are the chief of general staff of any country, near or far, it will be a serious error not to incorporate these tenets into the planning for your military doctrine. Let's say, touch wood, in a worst case scenario where we have a serious mishap in relations with one of our, again, near neighbors, it would be a mistake to assume that the means employed against us would be simply kinetic. Indeed, like the cyber advanced persistent threats, the best, most technical form of malware, which is employed long before you sense it, which resides within your system long before you detect it. And when you detect it, that means the communal resilience or the body politic has already started to fray. So that's the cyber. But if you take the informational warfare, I think it was Lenin who said that propaganda cannot just be words, it has to be action. So one actually thinks through how the militaries would, far in advance of any kinetic action, employ some of the means we are talking about. And again, without meaning to cast allegations or smears, the means and the tools are actually there because you have these hired guns for hire, which have a presence. The Ministry of Law Green Paper mentioned the Saracen phenomenon, this fake news mill or fake news farm in Indonesia, which is very, very important as well, because my understanding is that those kinds of techniques have thus far been used partly to bring down the Jakarta governor, and now for character assassinations against other very high-level politicians,
including the president.
Including the president himself, to smear him with allegations of being too close to China or the Chinese. These are just examples. But that's so far been limited to Indonesian domestic political machinations. But the tools and the stratagems can just, with one or two tweaks, be turned against Singapore itself in the event we have a serious mishap or falling out.
Thank you. Would you explain the next paragraph at page 4, the last paragraph of your written representations? You say, likewise with actors in the information disinformation space, often these people who are willing to help or be co-opted, sometimes little or no reimbursement. One expert, and we go over the page, from a Western European country told the present author, that's yourself, that disinformation in his country was carried out by not more than 10 individuals with pronounced right-wing sympathies living in Moscow. So this phenomena can be created by a very small number of people with determination and skill.
Exactly, and by the host or the aggressor country, Minister, not necessarily using that much by way of resources or it's expending that much funds to do it, just co-opting within the country itself, the target country, individuals who feel some sympathy for its cause.
Right. Then the next paragraph, you refer to the Chinese Internet Army. I think it's self-explanatory. Can we go to page 6 of your written representations, the middle paragraph, last few lines, starting with one difficulty. One difficulty with this is that kinetic armed warfare deterrents can be effective as actors involved are prepared to display their force. However, in the disinformation space, as well as more generally in cyber, deterrents may not be effective as state actors are not prepared to show the arsenal of tools they have at their disposal. Concomitantly, the actors involved do not show what their red lines are, where the threshold that might invite retaliation has been breached. Would you explain that?
Minister, if I may, I'll take a leaf from the cyber issue, which we also follow by way of comparison. There have from time to time been high-level expert groups, either academics or, in the cyber case, the UN Group of Governmental Experts, the GGE, which attempted to come to some sort of understandings, rules of the road, what the red lines are, what you can and cannot do in terms of cyber conflicts. The UN attempt suffered a serious reverse. People are sensitive about it. They deny it's a reverse. In my view, it's a reverse in the middle of last year. Torpedoed, in my view, by the big powers who very much considered the status quo as being a good state of play to have. Status quo meaning no rules of the road. Now, if we take that
Sorry,
thinking...
can I just clarify? In your view, therefore, there is very little likelihood that countries of the world will come together and have an agreement or a code of conduct, right, on this?
On the cyber and the adjunct issue, disinformation, extremely unlikely.
Right.
In fact, if I might add, for disinformation, fake news, even more unlikely, because the people who know cyber very, very well from time to time talk about a stage, let's say in 20, 30 years, where you have cyber strategic weapons of such potency that they have the capability to bring down a nation state itself.
Right.
But that's cyber, that's malware, that's cyber attacks. For disinformation subversion, the discussion hasn't even progressed to anywhere near that level.
The reason I'm asking the question, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that one or two of the representatives, I think, have put forward the fond hope that Singapore and others should try and create an international alliance to bring about norms and binding agreements. But I think your answer is quite clear.
I don't want to sound too dismissive, Minister. For
Right.
example, for Singapore's ASEAN chairmanship, there's certain
Right.
cyber knowledge sharing, capability
Yes.
building know-how we could and perhaps even should
Right.
do. But that's difficult as it's too difficult in my view to say that norms can be built, certainly within the foreseeable future.
Right. Let alone binding agreements.
That will not happen in my view, Minister.
Right. I interrupted you. Please carry on.
No, that was my point.
Right.
So norms, extremely difficult for cyber, nearly impossible for disinformation subversion, because the tools are too sensitive, too secret. You want to keep them to yourself.
And anyway, it is particularly in the context of asymmetric warfare. If Singapore is, in conventional terms, in a strong position, why would others want to agree with us to give up something that might give them an advantage?
Exactly, Minister.
Yeah. Page 7, starting with the paragraph at the top. Now you talk about implications and recommendations for Singapore. You say any nation operating on a democratic model with regular elections and an open internet regime should be watching carefully the techniques and tactics tried by powers that have tried to influence and undermine society in countries such as the United States and Europe. But beyond this, what is urgently required is serious study of the particular effect that organized disinformation campaigns can have on states that are polyglot and multiracial, and which are also data-rich states that aim to be smart nation. That sort of is a precise descriptor of Singapore, isn't it?
Yes, Minister.
These would be tempting targets. An aggressor could attempt to peel off one particular ethnic group or religion using social media and disinformation to appeal, as the case may be, to deeply ingrained historical, cultural issues, setting off one group against others or even against the government. Singapore can be a sandbox for subversion. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Minister, I don't want to cast allegations, smears again, or to be a fear-mongerer, but in my view, it would be a mistake to assume that this is not already happening in Singapore. These are advanced, persistent threats. You deploy them long in advance before you actually need to use them.
Yes. Now, one side point, you talk about Russia using these techniques, developing them. You talk about China, but frankly, any large country, including the United States, countries in Europe, that take their defense, and here offense and defense is tied intricately, you would assume that they would have studied and they would have started developing their own abilities,
Yes.
both offense and defense.
Yes, Minister. For it to work, it has to be active measures in the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And likewise, while we cannot put a finger to it, given the availability of these techniques, private consultants for hire, not all of whom would be as flashy as Mr. Sepulveda, smaller countries, much less resources, particularly when they feel that their conventional capabilities don't match another country, will be very seriously looking at these techniques and information warfare.
Yes, Minister.
That is something that we must take seriously.
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. Now, you say in the next paragraph, if we can have that, page 7, second paragraph. It should be observed too that countermeasures against disinformation should not be concerned solely with threats emanating from afar. There is evidence that some of these techniques are being used in some of Singapore's near neighbors. Data-driven political consultancies appear to have been engaged by political parties as well as individual candidates in the coming Malaysian general election. This will build up the expertise and capabilities within the region, right?
Yes, Minister.
And the techniques would have been tried for a quote-unquote local environment.
Yes, Minister. And it has the, if I may add, potential to leak out later because the tools are developed.
Yes.
It can leak out to the hands of less savory characters, which is actually what happened in the case of Cambridge Analytica, initially developed by academics.
Right.
Now methods and techniques used by others as well.
So it can easily go out to many other people in the region who can have their own reasons for, say, attacking Singapore.
Yes, Minister.
And in the next paragraph, you refer to the Indonesian examples, Sarakan and Ahok, and even the president, which you have already referred to. Unless you have anything to add to what you said earlier, we can skip.
Yes,
Thank
Minister.
you. And then you suggest various ways in which we need to try and deal with this issue, and we understand that. But I think what we can say is the nature, particularly the evolving nature of the threat and the seriousness appear to be such that I suppose all that even you as an expert can say at this point in time is we have to try all of these with no certainty that any particular method will in fact be the silver bullet.
Agreed,
or a
Minister.
set of silver bullets.
Agree, Minister, we have to try.
Yes. Finally, I think in the last page, you have referred to the national newspapers. I think if you take the Straits Times and Leni Chapao, I can show you some figures taken from their annual report in terms of their circulation. They're holding steady, in fact, I think doing quite well. These are public figures, and because they're a public company, it's audited. If you see the combined figures between 2015 and 2017, they've actually shown a marginal increase. The print figures are coming down. That's the nature of consumption. But the online figures appear to be going up. Now, precisely how long people spend and what sort of consumption, I'm not an expert. I'm just taking these figures off the top line. But I think the point that we both probably can agree on, all of us can agree on, is that you need good newspapers which people can trust. But again, that's not going to be the silver bullet. It's got to be one of a series of solutions. If you had a good newspaper, that alone is not going to help. You've got other things to do too, right? But I think if you look at the standing of the newspapers, the main English and Chinese newspapers, the overall circulation seems to be holding steady. And if you look at comparative sort of studies on trust in them, we seem to be doing much better than many other countries. That's just a point for you to, for me to just put to you. But I think we both agree on the broader point that we are going to need a whole series of measures. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Minister, I agree.
Right. Now, you then, I think it's a point we have anticipated, but if you look at that last paragraph of your statement, even as governments clamp down on fake news through legislation, fact-checking websites and NGOs that put out correctives, the actors behind fake news appear to be calibrating their methods. And in the last few lines, you say, as one commentator observes, it is easy to manufacture a lie, relatively cheap to distribute it widely. To demolish that lie takes intensive effort, and meanwhile, the nature of the internet ensures that it, meaning the lie, lives, breeds, and reinforces other lies. Would you want to explain that a little bit?
Yes, Minister. If I may be permitted to, excuse me, take a leaf from the study of violent extremism, which my think tank also does. Singapore has had different waves of the terrorism threat. The JI threat, more latterly, online self-radicalized. As you have pointed out within the last few days, Minister, the online self-radicalized are particularly tough nut to crack. The success rate in counseling rehabilitation for those who got their ideas online, maybe groomed by IS people online, WhatsApp, Telegram, it's much more difficult. Now, of course, disinformation is a different issue from terrorism, but at the same time, there are certain conceptual similarities in terms of echo chambers, filter bubbles. Some of the ISIS fanboys are so happy they seem to inhabit this world where everyone's agreeing with them. People on the left, the right, separate chambers are takfiris, deviationists, you bump them off. They are fit targets. Something similar is happening in the fake news, disinformation space worldwide. Again, to go back to the terrorism space, Singapore has a good track record at de-radicalization, rehabilitation. However, I've seen people, many people, radicalized online, worldwide. I've seen very, very few people de-radicalized online. It's possible to de-radicalize people. I've never seen it wholly done online. Not to say it can't be done. But whenever I've seen it done, not just Singapore, but worldwide, there must be some active human agency involved, together with any online countermeasures you try. I believe that to be the case for the fake news, disinformation space as well. And I think that's useful because I believe many submissions, including mine, have called for fake news fact-checkers, online better, more robust counter-narratives to be put out. But I think that's useful for our thinking that we are going to grow up in 20, 30 years with a digital generation which has only ever known digital. As the Straits Times figures, which were surfaced just now, showed, circulation is in fact very healthy if one includes digital.
Yes.
But I wonder whether if you look deeper at the issue, that brings with it risk as well. Ideas come into your head, you foment, you think, you get worked up, ideas go out.
Absolutely.
So I think this is going to be a big problem. And I wonder whether we need more real-world interventions. I believe I mentioned, for example, the SG conversation 5, 6 years ago had nothing to do with these issues, but it was good to get different people, Singaporeans. I don't know you, I don't agree with you. You leave feeling I still don't agree. At the same time, this person's a Singaporean. I've been forced in the room to rationalize, to have discourse with him. Whatever we do eventually to fix the so-called fake news, disinformation problem, will certainly, in my view, have to have some level of real-world intervention.
I cannot agree more. I think if I may just share with you a little bit of the evidence that was given yesterday, the problem seems to have these sort of different aspects, and I'm not intending to be comprehensive. The intentions of the attackers are quite clear. If they are foreign state actors, that is to undermine your sovereignty, your will to fight, to win the war, even without having to shoot a bullet, if possible, but otherwise as relatively light kinetic operation as possible, because they weakened you and divided you. And we are a sandbox because we have inbuilt potential for being divided along racial lines, along religious lines, along sort of nationalistic lines. Many countries do, but we are a small place and easier to exploit. So the intention and the will is there on the part of many people, both external and internal, in the sense that internally there can be people who do this for profit, for other motives. The technology is there. It has been tried successfully, with varying degrees of success, but it has been tried successfully in Europe, in US, in other places. We face this, and the fact that in conventional military terms we are in a superior position also makes us a target for others. And if you put all of this together, one of the key techniques is to actually divide our society, to reduce, to destroy trust between communities and the government, and also institutions. We had the churches and the Buddhist Association here. People also want to destroy, attackers also want to destroy people's faith in institutions, including religious institutions. So, and they want to flood them with disinformation to such an extent that you no longer know what is true and what is false, and you become cynical, and you prefer to be in your filter bubbles and echo chambers. The antidote to these very powerful forces have to be, I think, looking at the challenge and the problems, and I would say this just based on the evidence so far, what has been suggested should be is, you do fact checking, though everybody understands that the truth limps very far behind the lie and perversely reinforces a lie for most people based on some evidence of the way the human brain works. Truth doesn't really convince many people who want to believe in certain things. And a lot of people are polarized and want to believe in certain things. But you have to have fact-checking, preferably organically within the society itself. Second, I think you are going to need extensive public education, but that's going to take time. Third, you need to build even more actively the bonding within community. And I think the kind of conversations you talked about, where people feel part of the country and feel valued and feel that they have a stake and they want to do something for the country and for themselves, and by sticking together we all benefit, that kind of feeling has got to be encouraged. And that's not going to be done by some rules or regulations or laws or diktat or online. You have to have state agencies do that. And you probably need a kind of legal framework to make clear, whatever you have in the physical world, whatever is outlawed in the physical world is outlawed in the online space, and also to target the specific threats and reduce the virality and the speed, and if necessary, take down obvious falsehoods. How that is to be done, it's got to be thought through, but these were some of the suggestions that were made yesterday. And I think one thing that has come through is you're going to need active intervention by human agencies, government as well as non-government. You're going to need a clear conceptual framework. And yet, with all that, I think no one is in a position to say that it will definitely succeed, because the attackers are also evolving their threats. But, that's the sort of perspective on the evidence yesterday.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah. So we accept fully your point. I mean, I'm not saying I accept for the purposes of the eventual recommendation, but I accept fully what you mean by human agency. I can only speak for myself. The other members might have their own views. But I can't see how this can be done without the intervention of human agency. So thank you, Dr. Jayakumar. Others may have some questions for you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Jayakumar, for your very enlightening explanation. I think you've actually given us a perspective of the harsh realities of the world today with the myriad of possibilities that's now open for those who wish to influence opinions and subvert societies, as well as what you mentioned earlier about the issue of radicalization and difficulty of de-radicalization. And I think these are some really hard truths that's not very accessible to many people. I'm not sure if the public is aware. So I'm just wondering, in your assessment, whether these concerns is something that is available, something that the public is fully aware of, and if it is not, what more can be done by the government or other agencies to help encourage this awareness? Because I think without this awareness, it might be difficult to understand why some steps and measures need to be taken to address the concerns, especially of deliberate falsehoods online.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there are a few parts to that. Government can do some. As I think has been said, we can't do all. Government can't do all. One is, I understand there was wide-ranging review of national education, which took place under MOS Chanel. That would be quite important. And I would think, without having seen the fine print or the minutiae, that the type of threat education that comes under any revamped NE or even the social studies syllabus, besides looking at terror and cyber, as it must, I think, should look at fake news, disinformation, which I think is the threat of our times, even in some ways more so than terrorism, where sometimes we tend to take the easy way and think the thing which is going to hit us is a terror threat. I'm not so certain. I think it may well be terror, slow burn, creep issues, where we're like this boiled frog. You don't realize you're being boiled. Because as I said, many of these threats are set in place years in advance. So that's one. The other would be something I think I've mentioned in my paper, which is relooking, specifically within NE, the psychological pillar of total defense. And the number of reasons why I say this, I won't get into a long story now, but this, to me, seems to be one of these sort of orphans where there's no one clear single agency which takes care of it. I'm not suggesting there should be, because sometimes when you designate one agency, every agency thinks, oh, that's not my problem anymore. And certainly not my intention to suggest that. But the psychological is in some ways the hardest to get to grips with. And I think we need to do some serious thinking about that. Third would probably be something which I briefly talked about just now, which is the real world value of having face-to-face conversations. Now, of course, a lot of this already goes on at the RC level, somewhat behind closed doors. At the IRCC level, the IRO does very good work behind closed doors as well. I think these are generally known by the people who should know. But I wonder whether there are ways to go even further. And I'm not trying to be critical of any effort by any government agency, but sometimes for some of these events, grassroots events, for example, or even events hosted by the RCs, it might be the same people, or rather the same types of people who turn up. And I wonder if there's a way to go a little bit further into that. The last, which has not been mentioned yet, but I think it's very, very important, it's intimately tied into the fake news, disinformation stakes, is intolerance. You have various forms of intolerance in Indonesia, and frankly in Malaysia as well, seeping into Singapore. You have various forms of non-Islamist extremism. Sometimes we concentrate too much on the Islamist Hindu fundamentalism, which didn't start in this part of the world. But in parts of South Asia, it's happening. Moderate figures who are of that religion are simply not religious enough to get lynched. And I wonder whether there are some signs of this actually seeping into to Singapore. It may well be human agency, but I think aided by rapid rise of social media as well, social media penetration. So Singapore, therefore, can be a sandbox for subversion for these issues. And I think these need to be looked into, and we shouldn't try to isolate one particular strain of extremism or intolerance at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Sun?
Thank you, Dr. Shashi. To follow up on the point that you made about, on page 10, to revisit and review total defense, I thought that was a very important point that you made, and also in response to Ms. Rahayu's question. I would like to refer to the last line in that paragraph, whereby you mentioned to emphasize the importance of civil-military cooperation. And then you also make a point earlier about what the IRCCs and the RCs can do in their communication with the public. I would like to inquire from you, how do you see that balance? Because sometimes when we talk about some of the issues that you mentioned earlier, the examples that you provide, there could be some sensitivities to it. How do we relate it in a manner that the population in Singapore would understand, so that they see the importance of these issues, the impact of fake news online, and how that could impact the resilience of Singapore society? How do you see us managing that balance when you talk about civil-military cooperation?
Thank you, ma'am. So a couple of points here. Civil-military cooperation, and perhaps this point did not come clearly enough. In various national security setups all around the world, you've got perhaps the military authority, perhaps a separate authority in charge of cyber defense. Sometimes there are overlaps, or sometimes they are fused. Sometimes, in some unfortunate countries, you have a very clear demarcation between the agency involved in the cyber defense and a separate national cohesion or cultural agency, and then the military. And they don't talk to each other enough. And in my view, I'm referring particularly to parts of Europe, you have the aggressor or the hostile agency actually trying to take advantage of the fact that there are silos or gaps between these agencies. Because if one thinks about it, disinformation, fake news, is this a kinetic issue? Is this a resilience issue? Is this a cultural issue? Or is this, in fact, a cyber issue? So everyone's running around, not here, elsewhere, in sixes and sevens, wondering who takes charge, who takes ownership. And I think this is very, very important, because if these gaps are not plugged, these tend to be exploited. So that's the first point. The second would be how to go about making a start at looking at this. Again, I'm going to take a leaf, if I may, from the study of violent extremism, which I look at, my think tank looks at. We have in Singapore a very good track record at de-radicalization. That's fine. Others, particularly again in Europe, parts of Northern Europe, are looking not so much at de-radicalization, but very, very early intervention in schools, at risk populations. There are different names for it. They call it diversion, disengagement. The nomenclature doesn't matter so much. But I wonder whether these sorts of things, where you're trying off-ramp approaches, even before you can fall into the at-risk category, that's where you make the real difference. Because you think about someone who's been caught because he's an IS fanboy planning to go to Syria. Sure, you can try to de-radicalize him. It's tremendously intensive in terms of time, effort, resource, multiple agencies. I'm not saying it's too late. It's still worth trying. But try very, very early on. Now, take that kind of thinking and look at the fake news, disinformation stakes. I'm not suggesting that we de-radicalize in a similar vein, far from it. But from a very, very early stage, and some European countries I've studied trying this, important thought exercises which make you much less amenable to falling for simple social media hoaxes, phishing attempts, or even influence attempts. In fact, some states used to be better at this in the old days, where you go into a supermarket and you see the expensive stuff they want you to buy. It's all at the eye level. And then you buy it because you've fallen for it. But of course, once it's explained to you, once you know what's going on, you're much less likely to fall for it the second time around. So I'm drastically oversimplifying the issue, obviously. But I wonder whether we need to make a start in that vein in building a nation of critical thinkers. Because as I said in my paper, I believe smart nation is fine, but the wise citizenry is the one which is far, far harder to achieve.
And sorry, you're suggesting that this should be an approach that is undertaken by a government agency and also then at the next level, a grassroots organization? Is that how you would?
Everyone has a part to play, ma'am. The Straits Times has a part to play. And I should clarify, I wasn't trying to be too critical of the Straits Times. It's a superb newspaper, widespread credibility. And yes, if you include digital, its readership is very, very healthy. But in any future attempt to come together for the sake of argument in, let's say, an anti-fake news coalition, one would anticipate that the national newspaper of record, as has been the case in other countries, would have a very, very important role to play. So that's one. Or indeed, in some countries where the major networks or websites like Facebook have, sometimes of their own volition or because of law, had to engage national newspapers in order to do some of the fact-checking and the anti-hoax activity, they would also have a role to play. Start, I think, not so much with government, but any agency which has tremendous credibility and trust in the eyes of the public. It may well be government. For example, and I confess an interest here, I'm a member of the board of the National Library. I sit on the board. Some of these discussions, half serious, half joking, I've raised in the past at the board level is NLB's visitorship and readership is very, very healthy if you include digital. Is there a case to be made for saying, and I don't think there's widespread agreement with me, case to be made for saying that try to go back to make people read books again? I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm not sure if I'm taken seriously, but the other is simply to assume that that's not really an issue. It doesn't really matter. And in 20, 30 years, when everyone is digital natural and digital natives, the risks that come with it, the downsides that people don't talk about so much, are some things that we'll just have to manage. So it's either one or the other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jayakumar. You said earlier the best of the actors in the game use the full suite, but not necessarily the entire suite. They know when to chop and change and utilize that precise tool in the spectacular toolkit. I think that's actually interesting, and also tells us that we're dealing with people who are more than intelligent and who are more than strategic. So, but what we're typically dealing with would be a concerted effort aimed at destabilizing the country, whether it is to put them on the correct path or for their own selfish motives. On the other hand, in order to defend ourselves against such tools and such attacks, we will have to engage a whole suite of defenses. And again, whilst I agree with you that we should not have psychological or even structural silos in the way we approach the defenses, sometimes it is also quite inevitable that all these gaps and lapses will happen. So when we have an attack and you're dealing with a coordinated attacker which is able to chop and change, we on our part may not be able to respond as quickly in shielding and in chopping back. So do you have any suggestion as to how we could respond in a more coordinated manner? Do we need a, how much executive powers are required in this case? And also, secondly, in relation to the issue of think tanks. But maybe I'll let you address this first. Yeah.
Thank you. How do we respond in a more coordinated manner? Well, I'll go back first, ma'am, to the point you made about chopping and changing. Without seeming to be overly critical of Singapore society and the Singapore youth, because I think we are fairly resilient, the problem, if I could call it a problem, is that we have grown up not just in normal, but super normal conditions. When is the last thing anything of note, seriously of note, happened? Now, of course, the government has, in my view, done the completely right thing in changing the discourse to not if, but when, in terms of a terror attack. It's the right thing to do, and I think we've learned important lessons from what's happened in terms of terror attacks overseas. So again, borrowing from the terror side, let's look at what happened in different diverse societies overseas when something did happen, something tragic. So Sydney, the Manharun Moniz hostage taking. Paris, Charlie Hebdo. The UK had a campaign, not in my name. France had Just Be Charlie, and Sydney had I'll Ride With You. Even Indonesia had Kami Tidak Takut, I'm Not Afraid. How do we get to that point where we can see a similar grassroots reaction, not necessarily just for the terror side or the kinetic side, but for the slow burn, slow creep issues? This one is much more difficult because you don't even know when it's been let loose. For real high-level cyber malware, some of the countermeasures now are quite good. They use AI to spot it when it comes into your system almost in real time. The aggressor side still has an advantage, but at least that's something. We have nothing like that for disinformation, active subversion campaigns. So I wonder whether, taking a leaf from what Israel has repeatedly told countries over the years, train, and rehearse, whether there is some, and this is just off the top of my head, whether there is some way to make a resilient nation which is also acutely aware of the need to be able to operate in compromised environments. Because what we don't have right now is a compromised environment. If you have a terror attack, as terrible as that might be, government will have its contingency measures. It will go after the bad guys, the perpetrators. Society, I believe, will have the resilience, will, and resolve to recover. So it's terrible, but I think we can recover. A long-term, slow burn kind of crisis in a compromised environment where there's anger, distrust, discord, communal tension, may be seeded by a state actor or a non-state actor. Very, very difficult. Not impossible, not difficult. And again, I'll go back to the question just now. Start young. That would be very, very important. I apologize, your second question.
Yes, thank you. But also in relation to your answer just, starting young is but it's again another long journey and also a slow one. We would also require immediate intervention at this moment to step in as well. And I do also note your point that it's easier to radicalize someone online than to de-radicalize someone online. So I think there is much that we need to do. We have indeed grown up in a super normal environment, and I'm not sure, personally, I speak for myself, I'm not sure how many people take our emergency preparedness days really seriously, or is that just an exercise for those who are involved in the exercise? So we do have to therefore find ways in which we can have our people see the seriousness of the threats that we are facing. Now, that leads me to the second point, which is on the issue of think tanks. If we have an environment, or if we have portions, and we do have portions in the population who look at cynicism at government announcements and government statements, it would be, in my view, not the panel's view, in my view, it may be ineffective if we had an agency, an anti-fake news agency that was actually run or managed or even funded by the government. So hence the issue of think tanks. And the question then is the staffing as well as the funding. How would we fund the think tanks such that they could maintain independence as well as integrity, and therefore win the trust of the populace?
Thank you, Pam. I'm a member of the think tank, the RSIS. It's very difficult to answer this question in a way I would like without seeming extremely self-interested. Let me put it this way. When events come to a crunch, think tanks and universities, academia will have to play their part. They will have to do research. Depending on the urgency of the situation, they need to advise government. They need to put out their own views. And I'd like to think that these views are independent. There's some integrity there, but there's also some sense of what the national interest is. I think that's very important. On the issue of whether the think tank is the key primary agency, which has to be, I'm not sure if you're saying this, ma'am, which has to be the anti-hoax. So I would think it plays a part in the spectrum. Here's where I come to the point about anti-fake news agency, or on the other hand, government agency. I wonder if there is daylight between the two that can be bridged. If I look at some of the best anti or hoax debunking networks or anti-fake news agencies worldwide, one of them from the Ukraine, my friend is actually in the room here today, he'll be testifying later. It is what I understand it as a loose coalition which puts together funding. Sometimes funding can be sporadic, unfortunately, from a variety of sources. The government may be in the mix, but it's usually either removed or seen to be several steps removed. The people involved in such loose coalitions, which operate sometimes in guerrilla networked tactics, just like the aggressor, may well be journalists, may well be academics, may well be broadcasters, may well be, and I've seen this in my travels, people formerly from MNCs who have very good experience in black ops, when companies are smeared by other companies, so they know the techniques and tactics. Because there's lots of money involved, they have to be fast, because the bottom line is affected. So getting together a community of practice, or a sort of a brains trust, I'm not talking about the ivory tower brains trust, there's a time and a place for that, but the people who can advise and debunk and sort out what's true and not true would, I think, be very, very helpful and very effective, both for the slow burn issues and also for the terror issues. For the terror issues, something terrible happens in Singapore, attacked by ISIS. Government will have to, of course, do certain things, put out statements, but the kami tidak takut, they're all right with you, the coming together again as one, I think is much better done from a ground up, grassroots perspective. And I would say that applies to the disinformation, slow burn issues as well.
Thank you.
Dr. Jayakumar, good morning. I like the last, when you quoted this commentator towards the end of your report, and I read, "It is easy to manufacture a lie and relatively cheap to distribute it widely. To demolish that lie takes intensive effort, and meanwhile, the nature of the internet ensures that it lives, breeds, and reinforces other lies." So my question is, we do know that whether setting up fact-checking sites, you referred to Stop Fake, which we will interview later. It is a very painstaking, very tedious process. For every incorrect report that you try to verify, there'll be hundreds out there. So my question is, it seems to be a losing battle. It takes so much effort, and the effectiveness of this, and this is one of the new recommendations that you propose, some new ones, some old ones. So back to this one about setting up a fact-checking site. How do you see that panning out in Singapore?
Thank you, sir. Is it necessarily really to reinvent the wheel? Because in certain locations and jurisdictions, sometimes depending on pressure applied on it, big entities like Facebook have actually been willing to work with the fact-checking organizations. Germany is an example. And I wonder whether there might be a case for saying behind-the-scenes discussions are necessary, perhaps in conjunction or pursuant to discussions on whether we need a law. I'll leave that to one side for a second. But getting them on board, because most of the information, the subversion, is actually pumped through Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So getting them on board would be, I think, very, very important. I am not sure if we need one big-ticket, grand, high-signature national anti-hoax or anti-fake news agency. The people who attempt aggressive, active measures against us use very loose, very nimble, active measures, and they have done they have done overseas for some time. And I wonder whether to fight networks, you actually need networks. I think this needs to be thought through very carefully. Perhaps today is not the day to come down on any definitive answer. But whether some of the nimbleness that the aggressor has to be parlayed into the defensive side as well. But I think this is a discussion which needs to be played out. But obviously, once you have one big ticket anti-hoax or anti-fake news agency, there will be some people who think they're problem solved. and that itself is a problem.
Would it be fair to say that, and therefore, the role of media companies and tech companies is also, or the need to engage them and they're part of the solution is also an important one?
Absolutely, sir. So everyone now has its eyes on nations which are either promulgating or considering legislative measures. I've just come back from Germany. We had a briefing by the gentleman who drafted the fake news law in the German Justice Ministry. What was important in my view was actually not so much the law itself, which is clearly a restatement of existing legal provisions. It is a reminder to the big companies, Facebook in particular, that their community standards, as useful as they have been, are not the same as national law. And the key thing in the recent German legal saga was to emphasize to the big networks that they have to comply with national law. And that itself is very important. But the Germans did it in a very clever way, not by strong arm tactics, by engaging behind the scenes, going to the top guys, Facebook in Dublin as well. And that's very, very important, because this nuanced approach, in my view, much more calibrated, reaped bigger dividends.
Okay. And finally, just for the avoidance of doubt, so in this suite of non-legislative measures that you talked about, you're saying that there should also be some proposed legislation that comes with it.
I think it would be helpful. I think particularly when it comes to calling to account individual agencies or perhaps individuals who have done wrong, who have actively seeded subversion, or depending on how the legal discussions take place, because I'm not a lawyer, the level of accountability or culpability in terms of the big networks or platforms for wantonly purveying some of this information, which has the potential to damage the body politic. Singapore is as small, as we all know, a multicultural, plural nation. We don't get second chances. To use the adage of our first generation leaders, it's like a vase. You drop it, you can never put it back together, at least not in a manner where you think it was the same as it was before.
Thank you. That's all, Chair.
Pritam Singh?
Dr. Jayakumar, thank you so much for your contribution. My question pertains to, and it piqued my interest just now when you spoke of the German law and your discussions with the German Justice Department and their equivalent of the Ministry of Law. There is some commentary in public about concerns that tech companies, given that the law has been implemented in Germany, are over-censoring or taking a very safety-first approach in removing news which falls in a gray area, for which definitions are not so convenient and not so easy to understand. Were there any discussions about how in Germany they are trying to resolve some of these problems with such laws?
Thank you, sir. I think the sense I got from the German officials when I was there is that the law is likely here to stay. However, within the last few days, with the Merkel coalition now confirmed, there have been tweaks or attempted tweaks, which, as I understand it, may attempt to look at a couple of the points that you've just mentioned. Germany is a particular case. They're acutely aware of not just current contemporary realities when it comes to extremist content and hate speech, but also the history, the tragic history in some ways, not just in Nazi past, but fears about totalitarianism and consequent fears about censorship of content. So they're very, very careful about that. But of course, there are two sides to it. The people who are involved in drafting the fake news law are actually very happy with it, and they think it is no problem. The people, this is my understanding from the content providers, the Facebook side of the house, view this as having pushed a tremendous burden onto them. For example, my understanding is that Facebook has had to hire in the region of 1,000 fact checkers in Germany alone, and had to hire a compliance, a legal team, specifically, retained lawyers, German lawyers, specifically for the purpose of servicing this law. So, and there have been, after the law was passed, well-known and quite idiosyncratic instances of, for example, a German politician, a high-ranking politician, his name escapes me, had a tweet of his, which is several years old, and the tweet saw him calling someone from the far right an idiot. That other person he criticized had said that refugees were a potential threat to Germany. This German minister called him an idiot. The tweet got taken down. So I don't know whether this is the content provider, in this case, Twitter's example to show that, look, you're going to have all these unintended outcomes and things you didn't bargain for if you push through the law. But there has been discussion about that as well. The other well-known case is, of course, Anais Modamani, who was this Syrian refugee who took a selfie with Merkel, later banded around in far-right circles, especially those linked to the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, saying this person's responsible for terrorist attacks. He was an ISIS member. He took Facebook to court. He lost. And some of the talk in the circles there is that this is actually a reason why this law was pushed through. But of course, this is a precisely good example because it didn't matter that it was not true. It didn't matter that it was debunked. You had Sergei Lavrov, months after the Russian foreign minister, talking and criticizing Germany about this. Oh, this terrorist took a selfie with Germany. So it didn't really matter because it had already been put out there.
Okay, if there are no more further questions, Mr. Jayakumar, we would like to thank you for your participation and your contribution to the select committee process. We'll be sending you a transcript of today's proceedings. If there's any corrections, please make it and send the transcript back to us.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sergeant Arms. Okay, may I now invite the next witness to come to the witness table?